Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the A Beautiful Life podcast. I'm here joined by my good friend Anthony Bruno. I know I haven't done a podcast in a little while, but as you can see, I've got my new studio set up. It's better than Joe Rogan's new one, apparently. Tony, how you doing?
I'm doing great. I appreciate you having me on. Colton and I would have these more informal talks while we lived together abroad. I think it was about time that we brought it to the Beautiful Life podcast framework.
This is going to be very formal.
Yeah. I actually have a what's it called? The person in the courtroom who copies down all the proceedings of the court.
You're asking the wrong guy. I have no.
Well, I've hired a person. They're just sitting in the corner, just recording everything that we say for later reference and for cross reference.
Yeah. So me and you would we lived together in Italy. Me, you, Jake Austin, Zach Horrible, Max Peebles, and we would like me and you specifically. You would come sit by me while I was falling asleep, and we would have these 2-hour-long conversations about all this miscellaneous stuff. And
Yep.
even last week, I called you and it was kind of a check-in, but we ended up talking for 2 hours on the phone.
Yeah, that's how it goes. It always snowballs. You know, you put our two heads together. We tend to create tangents for ourselves, which I think we both like to do, or at least back when I would essentially just read you a bedtime story you wanted me to do for you.
I don't know if I remember that part.
I mean, that's essentially what it was.
It was a Tony talk. That's what we called it.
Yep.
It was Tony talk.
They were Tony talks. Became very, very important to at least my well-being while I was living in Italy with Colton and those couple other guys. Just good to stay grounded, I think.
I would have thought it had the opposite effect, to be honest.
That it just repulsed me. It was the worst. Well, then it wouldn't have been 2 hours long.
Well, yeah, as long as I stayed awake, I guess. It would as long as it would take for us to.
Yep.
So I guess pretty much a bedtime conversation.
You know, you'd be sipping your warm milk. I'd be there next to you.
All right, so let's bring this back on the rails. Although this is exactly what I wanted this to be, but so you're getting your PhD at Brown, and you
Correct.
just enrolled in the PhD program in psychology. So tell me a little bit about what you've been studying and researching.
So I went to undergrad in Ohio at this small school near Columbus, and when I was there, the first research I got involved in was in vision. So within psychology, a lot of people are interested in vision and making computational models for vision, trying to train computers to see and identify objects the way that humans do, try to capture, vision perception in the way that humans experience it. But before you get to that point, there's some low-level research that you can do called psychophysics to test, the perceptual limits, I guess, of the human visual system. So I'm a musician, and I ended up getting advised by this professor. His name is Dr. Nestor Matthews at my undergrad, and he was doing research with this music group called the Canton Bluecoats, who are a drum corps. And they would come to my school every summer for their camp, their very intense training camp before they would go on tour through the drum corps competition calendar, I guess. And he was interested in seeing whether or not, the brass musicians of this drum corps or the percussionists or the color guard, the flag twirlers, that sort of thing, showed any perceptual differences in visual timing. So what he would do to analyze that, and what I am now trained in, he would write these computer programs where certain visual stimuli would, move on screen, rotate on screen, and through hundreds of these psychophysical trials, you can extract a person's threshold, and that's to say, the best that we can do, within how many milliseconds, within how many percent change of a stimulus can we detect whether or not it's moving in a certain direction or rotating, that sort of thing. And he found that the drummers of this drum corps had the finest timing precision to these visual things that he was experimenting with. So I got involved with that research, and we did a couple more of these psychophysical experiments, not just with musicians, but with just normal college student subjects. And then I continued into a summer research project where I kind of took a spin on that and wanted to test the same kind of visual sensitivities, but with more complex rhythms. So something like a polyrhythm, which is essentially just 2 meters kind of juxtaposed onto one another. So toward the end of undergrad, I gained a lot of good experience coding, doing this musical visual perception work. And here at Brown, I'm hoping to kind of forge my first year project around those ideas. It's a bit tough because of COVID. We're not really sure as a department what is going to happen for the new first years in terms of how we can get a first year project off the ground and eventually be able to present it come the fall. But it's going to be some sort of visual timing and rhythm sensitivity experiment that hopefully will give us a bit more insight about how finely tuned our visual system is to perceiving things like a complex rhythm. Because traditionally, and I guess more anecdotally, but also supported by research, we're very much better tuned to time in music through audition than through vision. So I want to explore, what's the limit of our visual system if we're being given musical type input that we would normally hear. How does that compare to how we perceive it when we hear it versus when we see it?
So are there any sort of tests as far as maybe blindfolding people or like blocking their ears, I would imagine, or making sure they can't hear and then playing different sounds? Is that sort of along the lines of what you're doing?
Yeah, well, we want to control for those possible confounds. So the project I did last summer, half of the conditions were auditory and half of them were visual. We didn't go to the extent of actually putting earplugs on a person or blindfolding them, but we wanted the auditory sounds, the metronome-esque beat that they were supposed to follow, and the visual flashing beat that they were supposed to follow. We wanted those to be as perceptually equivalent as possible, aside from the fact that one is being perceived in audition and one is being perceived in vision. Although there is some research kind of in the same lineage that I'm in with my advisor here at Brown and my advisor in undergrad that shows that even your left visual field and your right visual field, or should I say your left visual field actually has a perceptual advantage to things that are timing related. So if I have you cover your right eye and present to you, a couple hundred trials of something moving at you, and you have to judge whether or not it changed direction before or after the other thing on the screen, and then you do the other thing, you show that there's actually your threshold for the changing stimuli to your left field of view. It actually precedes your processing done by your right visual field by, I think, like 10-15 milliseconds, which is not a lot in the subjective experience of these things, but in the psychophysical, very much like a precision threshold measure. 10-15 milliseconds is a lot of time, especially when you think about how instantaneous a lot of these perceptions are in our day-to-day lives that we don't really think about. So yeah, that summer research project, we wanted to control for exactly that, because you can imagine that if you're being played an auditory metronome and being asked to track its tempo, if you're seeing something on the screen, that's going to possibly confound the processing that's going on in your auditory cortex or whatnot. So for those conditions, we would just present them with a blank screen and take that as we were controlling for the fact that they weren't, scanning through a novel scene or that sort of thing. But what we found in my experiment is that people's thresholds for audition and vision were comparable. They actually weren't significantly different at all, which contradicts the past research that I brought up, that typically we're much better at timing and timing sensitivity in audition than vision. So my first year project here is hopefully going to manipulate that visual stimulus and see what visual cues you could change within that would make participants' performance worse than if they were listening to something, to some sort of a beeping metronome or that sort of thing.
That's really interesting.
Thank you.
I think that often we sort of like to separate the senses, but I think there's a lot more linkage between them than a lot of people may realize. I mean, you always hear those stories about people who go blind or go deaf and then develop some sixth sense almost of telling what's going on because they're forced into reaching out with their other senses and developing those. But that's a little different because you're even saying that I guess if I was going to put it in the simplest terms, that in some ways you're able to see sound.
Yeah, well, so you're right. There's within the timing perception subfield of psychology. So people that are interested in this kind of topic of how we can keep track of our time perception or pick out a rhythm from any sort of visual thing or some sort of auditory thing. There's the side of it where people believe that we have a central clock within our brain where, regardless of the sensory mode in which we get some information that is related to timing, that it's processed through the central clock and then kind of dispersed to the brain area that it should be going to. So that is what my experiment supported, in that if your visual threshold and your auditory threshold aren't any different, then maybe that input, whether or not you're perceiving it through your eyes or through your ears, is being processed through the same brain area. That's just a general timing mechanism, and then it's being put into kind of reformatted into auditory information or visual information. And then there's the other side of the debate that thinks that each mode, so your auditory cortex has some sort of timer or your visual cortex has some sort of timer, and the research that has shown that we're much worse at timing through vision supports that view, of course, because you would imagine that it's just the case that because vision isn't as relied upon for timing in the way that audition is for things like music and rhythm, things that we hear, the things that we're commonly exposed to, then that timing mechanism in our visual cortex just isn't as, or doesn't need to be as acute as the auditory one. I think I subscribe more to the latter, and that I do think that it would be impossible for there to be some sort of central timer. But given the results of my past experiment, I want to manipulate this visual stimulus now in future experiments to try and generate that disparity that past literature has seen, where audition reigns supreme in the way that we perceive time and we perceive rhythm. That's a good way to put it, I guess, is that we do see sound, and in the context of my experiment, I mean, the only sound in the way that it was presented in my experiment was kind of this amplitude modulating wave. So it didn't sound like a beat metronome, but it sounded more like a hum that would increase and decrease in volume. And that sine wave is what would generate the tempo. And with Envision, you would do the exact same thing, except put it onto a screen. So you would get this kind of plaid figure that would be decreasing and increasing, kind of pulsing in and out. That would give you time. So essentially, the two stimuli are indistinguishable, other than your one is a sound wave and one is a visually, computed sine wave.
That's fascinating. I think the evolutionary need for that is what interests me specifically, is that you have to, you're like thinking about what circumstances human beings must have been in to evolve that sort of pristine connection between sound and vision. Threats were everywhere, right? We had to be on our toes as hunter-gatherers. So, it makes a lot of sense. I think that something I learned from people like Tom Brown and the likes is that we have our senses are a lot more powerful than we in the 21st century think they are, because as we're going day to day, the need to hear a twig cracking 50 feet away, or the need to pick up on the slightest movement in your peripheral vision is much lower, because we don't have those predatory threats in our day-to-day lives. Most of us do not, right? So it is kind of interesting. I would really wonder what these results would be. Maybe they'd be exactly the same, but what these results would be on some of those hunter-gatherer tribes that still exist, maybe in Africa and things like that, that they've been forced, and they still use these senses to a level that us in the 21st century don't require, right? Does that make sense, or am I offbeat here?
That makes a lot of sense. Our brains are so plastic, and life experience, at least my opinion, is that life experience matters greatly in how our perceptual systems, come to be, what generates our, subjective experience of consciousness. There's a phrase called perceptual learning, which the reason why the drummers have better visual sensitivity than the brass players is because of the perceptual learning involved in playing the drum must afford them some, or must teach their visual system to focus more on certain aspects of the way the drumsticks are moving, the drum height, seeing it hit the drum head, that sort of thing. So to your point, I think past, civilizations certainly were perceptually tuned to things in the environment that we had, like you said, we have no business being worried about, because we sit, like you and I right now, we're just sitting in our homes, talking on a podcast. There's no immediate threat of danger, something that maybe a couple thousand years ago someone would be more tuned to something in their periphery, maybe reaching in toward them, which there actually is some contemporary research that looks into that. So if you think of something as looming, so it is coming at you, and that can be in vision. I think it's a paper or a couple papers from the early 2000s, but there's a hypothesis that if something is looming or coming at you and something is moving away from you, your brain will actually subconsciously grant like a priority to the looming thing, and that would exactly that aligns with what you're saying about the evolutionary need to avoid predators or that sort of thing. If you have a bear that's coming at you, and then maybe in your right visual field you have a different animal that's moving away from you, although they're not different in the way that you perceive them, because the dangerous thing is looming at you, you will actually experience kind of the experience will kind of perceptually jump in priority so that you're able to attend to it faster and you can take care of the threat versus the thing that's moving away from you, if that makes sense.
It totally makes sense. And I think it's really interesting that you, as a talented musician, would come into a field of research like this, because obviously being a musician isn't your full-time gig. But for you to find a research niche in psychology, and psychology makes a lot of sense for your personality, but for you to find a niche that actually is about that audio visual connection is super interesting, because I would think that in a similar manner that people who've played music their whole lives, sort of like you were just saying, like a drummer, when they hit something and they expect a sound to come out of it, right? That linkage between sound and vision, although they may be independent, but that linkage would be stronger than somebody like me who's just an amateur guitar player, right? And first, I don't even really look when I'm playing the chords, right? I'm not even looking at my hand per se, unless I'm learning a new song. But the drummer, it's all out in front of him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think later on, probably at in my time here at Brown, I want to look at more of those big picture issues, because you're right. Like, being a musician, I'm perplexed by the feeling of watching a live performance, and that is the combination of the auditory information and the visual spectacle that is a live concert, and that is a fundamentally different experience than just popping in some headphones and listening to a song where there's no visual input tied to that. And yeah, like you're saying, there's probably even differences with the kind of instrument you play in how that, like a term we use, sensory motor synchronization. So essentially, if a drummer is watching himself hit a drum, then there's a visual reinforcer to the auditory sound that's being perceived, and that must do something, Whereas, like you said, if you're a guitarist, being a saxophonist, I'm not looking at my hands playing the keys. And actually, in a subjective way, if I'm in a practice room and I'm looking at myself in the mirror while I'm playing, it's actually kind of a jarring experience because you're not necessarily used to looking at yourself execute those motor movements. So there's a ton of interesting.
It's like being in a portal. It's like looking through a portal or something.
Sorry, say that again?
I said it's like looking through a portal or something at yourself, right?
Yeah. Right. And there's, as a saxophonist versus a guitarist versus a drummer, there are different, there's different perceptual information that you need to execute, I guess, the behavior of playing the instrument. And then, like I said, just the spectacle of live music, being an observer, what's happening, at the perceptual level that makes going to a live show so captivating or so emotional or so evoking in some way, and what's its significance in a cultural manner also, because music has been around since humans have been around. And the aspect of live performance is so heavily linked with almost every aspect of human being.
Yeah, I witnessed that firsthand when I went to Tanzania in Africa this in January, and they were playing instruments and things that were very primitive. And you thinking about it, it's like, I don't know how long they've been playing those instruments, but it could have been for millennia, right? It could have been, the earliest. Mm-hmm. The earliest humans could have been playing those instruments. They're very primitive. Even something like a guitar is more sophisticated because of the way the guitar is carved and the strings, and you need steel and things like that. But the idea of just attaching some strings to a stick, right, and having something hollow underneath to echo a noise is not that complicated, and that comes up cross culturally. It's something I like
Right.
to think about too. Is something like the bow and arrow is something that was developed cross culturally in cultures that are independent from each other, that would have had no contact, and yet we see it's not like we started out with a bow and arrow. That was a technological invention, right? So after human beings split off and we had these isolated groups, that became something people discovered together. And music is something similar. Each culture has their own way of developing music. Music is almost something that is unique and essential part of being a human being. Like if you play a song and a cat's in a room, it almost has no effect. Or a dog, at least of what I've seen. This is totally pseudoscientific. Like I have no idea, but my observation is that animals don't care when you play music, but at the same time, birds sing and things like that. But this highly sophisticated set of instruments and chords and melodies and harmonies that are so, like, music theory is borderline scientific, right? Like it's not like a hard science, but when you actually, and this is something for somebody who knows basically nothing about music theory, so I don't know if I can make that claim, but when you actually look at how these melodies interact and things like that, there seems to be like when you hit a bad note, like that seems to be universally, it's like something's off, which is really interesting because you would think from an empirical point of view it's just a sound, right? But actually hitting the right notes seems to strike a chord in us. So it's like this is like of a higher nature. This is higher up on the hierarchy of music.
Well, there's an interval in music called the tritone, which essentially is a note played from like, let's say you're playing like in a G major scale. That's like playing a G and a C sharp. So it's the interval between a perfect fourth and a perfect fifth. And that interval was actually banned in religious composition for hundreds of years because it had the religious sentiment of being tied to Satan and tied to the devil. So, how do we get to that point where you're right? All it is just vibrations in the air. And somehow there's a certain dissonance, a certain disgust that's tied to that sound that then caused, religious, sociological, musical implications. And yeah, that's, speaking within the Western music, world, we have the 12 tone scale. So each note has the same amount of, pitch distance between the next one. And we know that if I play you something that you can say that it sounds consonant or it sounds dissonant, or maybe it sounds something close. But why that happens, why we have certain preferences for these harmonics, for these sounds. I mean, it's fascinating. And then how those things actually impacted groups of people, or how, now music that uses the tritone is allowed. I mean, it's, like outside of the religious sphere, you don't hear it, or you probably hear it more, but kind of how these things move and change over time in terms of how people are using it to express themselves or express ideas, really.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because the tritone being banned, I didn't know about that. That's really interesting. But if you ever listen to a score like The Lord of the Rings by Howard Shore, it's brilliant, one of the best cinematic scores of all time, in my opinion. And when that Mordor theme comes on, sometimes I get an anxiety attack, and it's not as if that's because I've watched the movie and I'm scared of orcs and Sauron. No, it's actually like, though that beat is doing something that's actually, it's having a physiological reaction, right? And it's changing something in me, right? And even, I forget the Japanese scientist who did those experiments with water droplets, where he would play this beautiful, like Bach or Beethoven music, these water droplets, and he would say things, to the water droplets like, "I love you," and like, "You're such a beautiful water droplet," and then he would freeze them, and the water molecules would come out in these brilliant, beautiful, molecular designs. And at the same time, he had a bunch of water droplets that he would play death metal to, and he would say, "I hate you," and he would spew all this negativity. And when he froze them, the water droplets were these deformed, like weird looking, droplets. So there is something scientifically going on. It's kind of like people are aware of it, but it's at the edges of our scientific knowledge right now. We don't quite know what music's role is. It's sort of a scientific mystery, because you can't really think of a reason why it would exist, right? If you're looking at the world through an empirical lens, all right, you could say, X needs this because of Y, and all these sort of things, and you can follow it linearly. But music is one of those things that it doesn't really quite fit into that box. I think humans could physiologically survive in that sort of view without music, right? You get food, you get water, you get shelter, but cross-culturally, music develops, and music actually matches and fits the culture that it's emerging from, right? And you see something like, Mexican music is more hot and upbeat, and then if you listen to music that's from more northern countries, it's going to be, it's going to match that sort of climate and that culture. And that's super, super interesting, and something that I haven't really explored scientifically, although I'm pretty sure it's at the borders of what we understand.
I think it is. If you think, yeah, like there is no brain area that's like the music box, that just doesn't exist yet. Somehow humans have these innate abilities, like the abilities that I'm studying, to track things like a musical tempo or pick out a rhythm from a visual stimulus, and those are things that must have some innate structure for, but also must be reinforced by something in our development also. And it has to be, because music, pervades every day of our lives, whether it's, celebrations or social gatherings, or, things like in movies, for example, when you're so gripped by that composition that's happening as you're watching something, like, obviously that's exactly why it's put there. And I think there's some research out there with music and like emotionality, as to say that, like, how music is able to impact your kind of mental state, and then how that can then change your perceptions of things like time and that sort of thing. But yeah, I think it'll, like, though we know that ancient peoples have used music, or music has been around for as long as humans have been able to record our history, basically. But like you said, it didn't have to be that way. But in saying that, then you're kind of saying, well, why would it have not happened? Because obviously it's so rooted in everything that we do. I think that's just because humans have to be creative in some way, and that expression, like you said, it's a reflection of the times, really. Through any culturally significant event or thing like that, there's always music to kind of mimic what's going on with the world.
Yeah, and music is just, I think I showed you this music artist I've been listening to, Akira the Dawn, who takes these
Yeah.
inspirational speakers or these motivational speakers or these philosophers, and he takes what they say and he puts them behind a beat, and it sounds like they're singing. He does it with Jordan Peterson, Jocko Willink, David Goggins, Alan Watts, and I listened to it for a lot, and I got a little bit run down with it, and I took a little break. But it was really interesting because while I was listening into that, I entered into some sort of hyper productivity mode where I would just slam out work for 12 hours straight and look at my watch and say, "Oh wow," and I didn't eat, and I just sat there and worked. It's almost like it is possessing you to some sort. Now, I guarantee if I had not been listening to music, I would have gotten bored or frustrated or unable to complete the task. Or if I was listening to, maybe something a little bit less focused, I wouldn't have been able to do it. I mean, for me personally, I wouldn't be able to work as well listening to hip hop or um, listening to death metal. Although I do like listening to heavy metal and I do like listening to hip hop in certain times in certain atmospheres. But it's weird because it's almost like you want the music. It's not like you just want to listen to music. You want music that fits the mood, just like in a movie score. Like you were just saying, when they're in Hobbiton in the Lord of the Rings, they play that peaceful soundtrack, and just listening to music gives it that feeling. And of course, there's tons of YouTube edits where people will put different music over certain scenes in a movie, and it totally changes the whole theme of that scene. Just like little tweaks like that totally gives you a different feeling about what that scene is, or what message is trying to be conveyed. And like even that Mordor soundtrack, there's something about those notes that invokes evil, right? That
Yeah.
invokes something that's measurable, as far as like it gives me a physical anxiety attack sometimes listening to it. Like I'll just put on a Lord of the Rings score sometimes when I'm working, and it's a great score, and then I'll just kind of zone out as I'm working, and then all of a sudden that da, 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 and then I'm like, oh my god, and I gotta like go sit outside and take a breath because I'm like, wow, what's going on? And luckily, like with meditation and things like that, I've actually learned how to control things like that, um, and kind of get over it. But it is kind of interesting that something that's really just noise would trigger something like that. What is the biological purpose of that? What is the evolutionary purpose of that? I don't know. Obviously, do you have any insights?
I don't know about insights, but if we're talking about the innateness of these feelings, I mean, no one. The first time you listened to that evil theme, no one had to tell you that it was evil. And I bet that if you survey 100 people listening to that, watching that scene for the first time, they would all describe it the same way. So whether or not there's some sort of, you know, some underlying structure within the brain that processes certain melodic intervals or harmonic progressions in that way to give it the emotional, like, semantic meaning of evil, or if we're just exposed to that as part of a person, growing up through a westernly a society where Western music gives these consonant dissonant intervals, where then over time we say, okay, this sounds good, this doesn't sound good. Um, Either way, there's something there, because that level of self-report of like, wow, that, yeah, like, it makes me anxious. You didn't have to think about that before you felt that way. It was almost instantaneous. And like I said, I bet everyone that watches that scene goes through the same experience as you without having to kind of question why it's making me feel this way.
They don't need the visual addition of seeing this red fiery volcano and these evil orcs marching to actually feel that, right? Obviously, it helps, but even if you listen to classical music that doesn't have that visual companion, you can tell when it comes into a lull, and they're trying to, the composers are trying to illustrate something darker or something
Mhm.
of a different light, and then when it gets more upbeat, they might start playing the flute or something like that, and like some Peter and the Wolf is a great
Yeah.
example, right? Where that goes from that, if I'm remembering correctly, like goes from that like high upbeat flute to kind of that lower tone when the wolf is sulking around, which is it's very interesting, and it's definitely worth thinking about because if you just start to question why would our brains spend so much memory, right? We have a limited amount of memory. It's not infinite. Why would it spend so much memory memorizing these songs? Like, how many songs do you have memorized where you know how they're going to go, right? You might not know the lyrics exactly, but when the lyric comes up, it's not surprising. You remember it. And you listen
Mhm.
to it over and over again, and eventually you memorize it completely. Why is that? I can't imagine why your brain would think that's important enough. There must be something there, right, that enables us to do that, because otherwise you're just hearing a bunch of, I don't memorize the, well, I guess I would if I was living in the woods. I would memorize bird calls and things like that just from sitting out there. So I guess that's not true. But that clearly has a purpose. Me memorizing bird calls has an evolutionary purpose. I could tell if one of them sends a warning to there's a predator nearby, or if one of them is a certain type of bird that I'm looking to hunt or something like that, right? So that would have an evolutionary purpose that's more obvious than music, and maybe it's as simple. Although I don't believe this, but maybe it's as simple as the fact that human beings did need to memorize bird calls at one point, translated to music, because birds do sing and they do make music, but that sounds a little
Yeah.
bit like a stretch.
Yeah. Well, I mean, how you're talking about how you described the flute sound versus a lower instrument sound, you're tying it back to other facets of, I guess, survival knowledge or things that would be relevant to a you know to an earlier human or to an earlier tribe in terms of being able to differentiate, safe from not safe or dangerous from not dangerous and that sort of thing. And I think music always ties back to some meaning in that way. I mean, we the timbre of a flute gives that kind of innocent experience. So if the composer is trying to paint some sort of imagery in your mind of a scene or an animal or object, then they know to pick sounds that would map onto real life examples of things that we might experience, walking through the woods or something like that. Um, yeah, I think music, and like you said, the reason why um, we're able to memorize and know so many melodies, so many themes, so many songs, and also be able to retrieve them from our memory, even if we've only heard like the first 2 seconds of a song. um, it's probably just because music is so abstract. I mean, it's like we don't know if how music is represented in our brain. Much like language, there's a lot of mystery around what is the fundamental unit of a word or of language or of music that our brain uses to construct and to pick out importance and meaning and semantics and that sort of thing. But it probably ties back to the need for abstraction in more of those survival situations. I mean, music can hold information. We teach nursery rhymes to babies, and they're melodic, but they also have some sort of meaning. Or if you think of "Ring Around the Rosie," I mean, that's now it's a nursery rhyme, but it comes from the time of the plague when it was explaining the progression of symptoms for people who would eventually die from the plague. It's like there's always meaning packed into it, whether or not we experience it as, really gaining the lyrics as verbatim what they're saying, or if it's more just the experience of music that is important in itself. That, I guess, that varies case to case. Like, for example, I'm not a very lyrical person. When I listen to music, I very much pay attention to the low end in the drums and the bass and the rhythm section. And lyrics to me are always pretty elusive. And then I can't remember lyrics to songs. But people like you probably are better at the opposite, which then could tie back to this perceptual learning thing of there was probably a divergence somewhere where maybe my musical training, playing a lower reed saxophone that often mimicked bass lines and taking drum lessons, probably culminated to me having a different perception of music than someone like you who plays guitar, oftentimes probably learning songs that you could sing while you play, or that sort of thing.
Well, I've always been really good at remembering words, like with movie quotes or something like that. People that don't know me well, I'll just start busting out all these movie quotes, and they'll be like, "Whoa!" And me and my cousin actually love to do that. We'll just quote. We have such a niche of the same interests, and we've seen like these same movies, and so he'll text me a line from a movie that could be a normal sentence to anybody, right? And I just instantly pull it out. And he sent me something.
Yeah, you might be able to.
No, because he sent me something yesterday that was just like a single. Yeah, it was a quote from Avatar: The Last Airbender. And he'll even slightly modify it. He said something that Sokka in The Last Airbender said. But it was totally out of context, right? It's not like we were talking about Avatar. It's not like we'd used this quote before. I've never heard him say it outside of the show. But I just replied to him, "Thanks, Sokka," because I know exactly what he's referring to. It's 5 words in a string, but yet somehow, I'm not the best at it, but I think I'm better than others. In a lot of ways with it. A lot of people say, you can remember movie quotes, but at the same time, I'm deficient in plenty other areas of memory. In song lyrics, it's kind of similar. Like my other cousin Olivia, she can memorize song lyrics no problem. And for some reason I can, but it's not as pronounced as a movie or something like that. In fact, I mess up song lyrics all the time, but I rarely mess up movie quotes, which is I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah, well, I mean, in psychology, in cognitive science, there's always the debate of top-down versus bottom-up influences on perception. So bottom-up is also known as like data-driven. So if you, for example, let's take that quote from Avatar. If you're purely perceiving that string of words through bottom-up processing, you're not using any prior knowledge you have or your relationship with Garrett, I'm assuming, or the knowledge of these movies or whatever to process what those 5 words say or mean to you. Whereas a top-down process utilizes that prior knowledge, that more abstract information that you've encoded over time to ascribe meaning to that quote. So probably subconsciously, the fact that it was Garrett that sent you the message and you have that kind of collective movie thing, primed your recognition of the quote as something other than just a normal sentence, which is interesting because that happens with people with lyrics or things like that. And it is funny how for some people that would just go right over their head. But given the context, the cues, just aside from the quote itself, in which it was situated, actually gave you that ability to immediately know exactly the intent behind the message, which was more so than just reading 5 words and saying, okay, this is what this explicitly means.
Yeah, if you said that to me, because we haven't watched that show together, and
No.
I haven't, and we don't really quote movies as often with each other. I don't remember much of us doing that. So I totally agree. So. The fact that maybe 30% of what me and Garrett say to each other is movie quotes.
Yeah,
probably primes my brain to be more in tune for that. I mean, sometimes we'll have a whole conversation that'll be 90% movie quotes, and it won't be the same movie. It'll be like a quote from this movie, hop onto another TV show, quote from this movie, and not even like, and we're just laughing the whole time. It's funny to us, and we really enjoy it, and other people are probably really annoyed, and they have no, actually I know they are, because whenever we're in public together, other people have no idea what we're talking about, and we're just laughing, and they have no idea what we're referencing. So it is kind of interesting that memory seems to pick up on these little things, and I guess something there is a human need for something outside of the physical, right? I mean, you can't really give much of a biological explanation for music or humor or love, right? I mean, you can, but they're not fully flushed out, right? I was watching Interstellar the other day, and Anne Hathaway says, "You love people that have died." That doesn't make any sense, like scientifically. That like there's no need for that, right?
Yeah.
And even with like humor, I've heard theories like humor was developed specifically more in men, so because men would use it as a way to attract potential mates, which makes sense to me. Not saying women aren't funny. Didn't say that. But it really is interesting that is a theory, but it doesn't really make sense considering that men joke around with each other all the time. In fact, men probably joke around with each other more often than they joke around. I would think men are more serious around women, honestly. In a lot of ways, men are probably more comfortable joking around, and when I'm talking with you or something, right, we get into serious discussions like we are now, but there's always humor in there, and sometimes our conversations are purely just to get a laugh out of each other, right? And those are very worthwhile, and that heals your soul, and it makes you feel better, and you know, laughter is great medicine, as that proverb says. So music kind of fits in that category with love and humor to me, where it seems to be, if you talk to somebody that is viewing the world purely empirically, right, there's so many things that we can't explain through that lens, and scientifically even right now. We talked about this last week.
We did. We did talk about this last week, and I think the point that I put forth was that, especially in recent years, science has been touted as the objective truth or the judge, basically, where the data drives your results, and those results should dictate how people should deal with the things that are being studied. Maybe it's contrarian to be someone who does science all the time and then also agree that science is just one form of explanation. But that's kind of what I think. And even further, like what you were saying about music and love and humor, there are people making philosophical arguments or more empirical neuroscience-based arguments that we shouldn't even bother talking about psychology or cognitive science, because every single thing about ourselves can be explained in terms of brain activity and neuroscience. And I just had to answer a midterm question about this argument, which I disagree because, our experience of consciousness is subjective, and it's so inexplicable and like striking, that how could you just dismiss it and only want to focus on the neurochemistry, or only want to focus on the amount of blood flow to a certain brain area at a certain time. It's something that really captivates me as a psychologist. It's the hard problem of consciousness, and my advisor in undergrad used to put it this way. I'm not sure if it's his quote, but it's, how do we get from neurons firing to a feeling? And if you're a reductionist, like the people that I talked about in making these arguments against psychology or against the importance of psychology, you're just totally dismissing the fact that neurons fire and produce this. You just want to care about the neurons. and I don't think we can do that, because there's so much about our phenomenological experience of consciousness that is just a fundamentally different thing, or thing that's so different in and of itself than just looking at kind of brain chemistry, or something like, what this region of the brain does versus that.
I mean, absolutely. And what is maybe everything has a how, right? Maybe everything has a how, right? I lift my hand up because neurons are firing, telling me to lift my hand up, right? But that does not explain the why. And even if it has a how, we're never going to know the why to some of these questions. And the scientific process can't get us there. It hasn't really gotten us anywhere further down the why path. I mean, that's why we do have things like spirituality and religion and philosophy. Those are exploring the why. And philosophy actually was the earliest form of science. It used to do the why and the how, and it sort of branched off into science, which explains the how, and philosophy, which explains the why. And now science likes to say that philosophy is meaningless, which is kind of interesting, because I think a scientific argument could be that music is healthy to listen to because it helps you release oxytocin or serotonin, and it helps you de-stress, and it could give you all these scientific reasons. But if I was to ask you this question, my uncle asked me this question. I had him on the podcast. My uncle Kevin. He said, we used to get into a lot of arguments. He actually changed my mind about a lot of things. And he's a musician of 60 years or so, and he's been playing guitar a lot. And I've always liked the Beatles since I was younger. He's a huge Beatles fan. And so he said, if you were listening to some cheap rock band, right, 10 years ago, and today you listen to the Beatles, you wouldn't necessarily say that your taste in music has changed. Rather, you would say it has improved, as if there is a measurable difference between the Beatles and the Black Eyed Peas, right? And coincidentally, they both wrote a song named "I've Got a Feeling," but that's irrelevant. I believe truly that there is a physical difference, and I think taste is a part of it. Now, I'm not going to shun any people that listen to Black Eyed Peas, but how do we measure that scientifically? You can't. It's not possible to measure something like that scientifically, right? And you can't even measure it with data or stats. I mean, Drake has more album sales than Abbey Road now. I think one of his albums passed Abbey Road. He tweeted about it and he was gloating.
Wow.
So just because there's more people doesn't mean that it's better taste. I think you would still find that I would like to argue that Abbey Road probably had a little bit more in it than Drake's latest album. Nothing against Drake, nothing
Yeah.
against hip hop, nothing against Black Eyed Peas, right? That's all different types of music. But if we're going to go to the pinnacle, which I would say the Beatles is, and I think most people would say that's a fair band to put at the top, if we're going to put one at the top, it has to at least be in the argument, right? Why is there a difference between the Beatles and Bare Naked Ladies? Why is there a difference? Because clearly there is, and maybe we could find the how for that, right? Maybe we could find out that it turns out music theory gets way more scientific, and they find out that music theory can have scientific backing, and that these notes actually have physiological and neurological reactions, and these notes being put together in this way in Abbey Road makes it a superior piece of music than Drake's latest album, right? But that doesn't really explain the why.
No, it doesn't. And the qualities of our conscious experience, from individual to individual, you're right, they're pretty immeasurable. And if you're in the camp that nothing matters except for neuroscience, then you hold the view that it's not even worth trying to quantify these differences. Like, for example, even if you take color, for example, like that blanket behind you is yellow, and I bet that you would agree that it's yellow. But there's no way for there to be a comparison of your experience of yellow and my experience of yellow. So the reductionist would say, well, we shouldn't even be thinking about these things because we obviously can't reach them, so they're not important. What's important is the brain state in which you perceive that as yellow versus I perceive that as yellow, and then we compare. And with music, I think it's probably, it's similar in that the subjective experience of music, can't be compared person to person. And that, why it feels that way may never be found out, because you would have to be able to access that conscious experience. And it's something that I don't think we will ever be able to do. I think since coming to Brown, my biggest takeaway is that the further you go, down a path of research or literature, that sort of thing, the less you actually know. And I think that there are like a lot of advances, technological advances in brain, measuring brain activity. We have fMRI and G and that sort of thing that can help us kind of chip away at that problem. But I think there's this, to put it in slight edge terms, there's a quantum leap of going from those measurements to like what it feels like to be alive that I don't think can actually be achieved with any sort of scientific inquiry. And scientists don't believe that. Because every cognitive scientist, every neuroscientist wants to be the person to like crack the code and solve the problem. And who knows? I could be wrong. We might get there someday with mapping out the genome of the human brain, and that would be fantastic. I'm not sure what it would do for us in terms of policy or medicine or that sort of thing, but it would be cool to know.
Yeah, I mean,
but for right now,
not to cut you off, but none of what I'm saying or what you're saying, I believe, not to speak for you, is saying, and obviously you wouldn't think this to shun the pursuit of science, right? Absolutely not, right? We want scientific pursuits, and scientific pursuits allow us to have a computer and have a podcast while we're 1,000 miles away from each other, right? So and certainly there's empirical and real truth behind science, and it's very valid, and anybody that argues against that gets flattened by any sort of logical analysis. But science likes to dismiss metaphorical truth, and it likes to dismiss other forms of truth that are equally valuable to the human experience. Right? You could live in Alaska where it's dark, 6 months of the year, and you could observe the high suicide rates. And you could say this is because of lack of vitamin D. And you could give everybody vitamin D and it might improve the suicide rates. But you say, what? The suicide rate's still lower. I mean, it's still higher than in other areas. Because why do we even, we can give you all the elements of the sun, right? We can extract the vitamins that the sun gives you. We can give you a sun lamp. We can do all these things. But if you're not feeling the sun on your skin, you're not seeing it, you're not experiencing what it's like to be a human being on this earth, right? You're probably gonna be more prone to depression, right? And that is something and the sun is something that's been worshipped religiously in cultures. It's been known as like the bringer of life. It's got a lot of metaphorical significance across cultures. In fact, pretty much every culture recognizes the importance of the sun. Even our scientific secular culture realizes it, right? Because we do know that, the metaphorical truth in cross civilizations and time is that the sun was the bringer of light and life. It just turns out that the scientific truth is the exact same. So those actually correlate, right? And that's not always the case. But we metaphorically knew that before, and we didn't need any scientific measurements to know that, right? And and interesting, like with the colors thing, a lot of scientific research thinks we evolved to see colors because of snakes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because snakes have these elaborate color patterns where they can camouflage so well that if you're colorblind, you're not going to be able to pick up on the camouflage. And snakes are, human beings' oldest enemy, right? It's we've always been dealing with serpents and snakes. And metaphorically, if you read something like the Bible, it says in Genesis that snakes and humans are at odds. It says in Genesis that the snake will always be the enemy of the woman, or something along those lines with Eve. And that you will always have to look where you tread because there will be snakes on the ground. So metaphorically in the Bible, it's not like the human beings who wrote the Bible did not know about the evolutionary history between snakes and humans.
Right.
They didn't.
Yeah.
But they picked up on that metaphorical truth. And if you study babies, we want to look at a scientific angle. If you study babies and you study people, there is a fear of snakes that is innate in human beings. Now, you can get over that fear, and people own snakes and fine. But when you see a snake, you have something programmed in your brain from thousands of years of interaction with snakes that says danger, right? Stay away. Similarly, in rats, if you have a rat that's never smelled a cat, never met a cat, never seen a cat, and you put it in a cage and you just have the scent of cat float through the room, it will freeze in fear and it won't move until the scent is gone. It'll freeze. And it's never seen a cat in its life. So that metaphorical truth from places, like the Bible, it holds up scientifically. And that was before we used scientific measures. And there's something to that. It's not just that we observed, I'm scared of snakes, there must be something to that. No, there's a deeper truth that we've extracted in these stories that sort of point us in the direction of that metaphorical truth. It's not as empirical as scientific truth. It's not, but it's not meant to be.
Yeah, I think you're right. And that's what evolution is meant to do. I mean, in being here taking one of the core psychology classes, we spent a lot of time on vision and the evolution of high level vision. And one of the take home points is that evolution produces not the optimal solution, but the satisfying one, or the one that's going to help us the most, or the trait that has been naturally selected to aid our survival the most. And science, I think, puts a lot of emphasis on the conscious awareness of those things, whereas, people through history, those things are innate, so they're just done. And the people who don't do those things won't survive, reproduce, so on. And I think that's the beauty of it, really, is that our consciousness, it affords us the metaphorical abstractions and more existential issues surrounding the things in our physical world that we perceive. We don't have to be hypercritical of the mechanisms that get that done for us. What we have the attentional freedom, I guess, to then pursue other things like philosophy and questions of metaphors and art and music and that sort of thing. Because if we had to be conscious of every action that we execute or everything that our body is doing for us to allow us to survive and move about the world, we would be hopeless. We would be hopeless because that's such a taxing. I mean, just think about the insane amount of computations or actions that happen at the neural level that we don't know are happening. And I think science, because we have developed a way to study and get data on those things, we want those to be the objective truths in place of metaphors, in place of faith, things that have been culturally accepted for thousands of years. And that's what we don't want. We want science to make our lives better. We don't want it to tear down, otherwise passable ways of thinking that prove to make people feel like they have meaning.
Absolutely. I was in this philosophy class. I don't know if I told you about this. So I was in this philosophy class my last semester before I graduated, and the class had a bunch of controversial issues, which I enjoyed, because that's who I am. And it was basically a bunch of moral questions. It would say, is abortion right or wrong? And it would have a class discussion. We would read articles for, we'd read articles against, and at the end we would come to our conclusions individually. And of course, everybody came up with different answers. And the professor kept coming up with these, transgender athletes in sports, all these moral quandaries. Should firearms be legal? Bunch of different things that fit in that moral category. And at the beginning of the semester, she asked, do you believe in absolute moral truth? And she asked it again at the end of the semester. At the beginning of the semester, a bunch of people said yes. At the end of the semester, only one student said absolute moral truth still exists, and that was me. And the professor actually messaged me and said, I'm glad somebody actually said this. And because she actually baited the question as if she wanted us to say no. And I actually thought that's what she would have said, but she's a philosophy teacher. There's no way she can't believe that, right? The whole study would be pointless. And so she actually said the question like this: given all the evidence for and against these issues, do you believe absolute moral truth is real? And essentially what she's trying to do is bait us into saying, well, things are too nuanced for there to be absolute moral truth, right? When there's good arguments on both sides, therefore neither side is correct. And I kind of dissected that and said, look, absolute moral truth, it's not a question of if it exists, it has to exist, right? There has to be an absolute truth. And if there's not, then nothing matters and nothing exists, right? Then basically my argument, and I wish I had it up because I'm doing a poor job reciting what I said. And one of the students replied to me that actually you have to reply to somebody else's post. And she actually wrote something really long. And it relates to this discussion. What she said is that, no, absolute moral truth does not exist. Philosophy doesn't matter. In a philosophy class, she said that. Because the only thing that matters is what we can scientifically observe. And so I just went after her, as you can imagine. I said I didn't have to, but I fulfilled my
But
obligation. But
yeah,
I was too tempted. It's probably one of the rare times
you're
I was actually being a good student and actually doing what they were
yeah,
going above and beyond. But
yeah.
and even then, it was more about my ego than anything. So I won't even take credit for that. I I basically said to her, look, like I just said to you, science came from philosophy. So for you to sit here in a philosophy class being ignorant of that and say that philosophy is useless because it doesn't have scientific backing is really laughable. Of course, I didn't say that it was laughable, but I basically said that, and even my uncle Kevin and I had this discussion on absolute moral truths and things like that in that podcast. And really, what it comes down to is that if you really want to believe that absolute moral truth doesn't exist, you could watch what happens to you in your life, and you can just observe how that belief makes you feel. You can observe how that belief makes you interact with the world. Now, that's not a good argument scientifically for why absolute moral truth is real. I'm not using a logical argument there as far as saying you can observe this and this and that makes it so. But I will say this. If you know people who really believe life is pointless and meaningless, do they seem happy? Do they seem like they are mentally in a good spot? Maybe they are, but my experience is everybody I've met who thinks that the world is meaningless and that there's no point, they don't really stay alive long. And if they do, they physically start to look and embody like their beliefs. They'll become overweight. They'll become unhealthy. They'll be plagued by all these problems. You can just see like their skin is not very lively. And that's empirical evidence to me to suggest that you need a way of finding meaning and purpose in your life. You need to actually find a route and a method that allows you to give yourself purpose. And that could be music. That could be love. That could be humor. And these are things that do not have strong scientific backings. Could be philosophy and asking questions, right? But I as we said last week in our call, Tony, life's just too much of it's too absurd. It's too much of a miracle for it just to be a coincidence, And if you actually open your eyes to that, you'll start seeing it everywhere. It's stunning that people can sit there and make the claim that nothing matters and we're just a speck on a speck, which physically is true, and say that nothing I do really matters anyway, when they're part of the most brilliant and beautiful thing that you can imagine. It's actually so beautiful and large and grandiose that you can't even comprehend it. You can't. There's too much to life, right? We were just, like you said early in the talk, the further you research something, the less you know about it, because every single thing you research has an infinite amount of things you could research about it. It's just like history. When I got my history degree, it's like at the end I was like, well, I feel like I know less because now I just know how much, I know about Herodotus, but I don't know much about Thucydides. And so what does it even matter? And I don't even know the first thing about Russian history. So therefore, is all my knowledge about the other areas of history irrelevant? I don't know much about South American history. No, it's life is just you can't just take something like life and just sum it up into it's all pointless. It doesn't make any sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think why do we want to pull back the curtain so much instead of just appreciating the curtain? I mean, it is a combination of taking things for granted and wanting to like it's almost adopting the mindset that life is too good to be true. And if it's too good to be true, then you're on the constant pursuit to like debunk the things that make it so special.
Or
So
I
if you
would
do that,
say,
then you're losing out.
I would say they even believe that in their perspective, from my experience, they think it's too bad to be true, right?
Right.
They think, oh, all these bad things happen to me. My life isn't perfect. Therefore, this must just be some coincidence where I was just thrown on this rock floating in space, and I have to suffer my way through it. And that's just such a dark. It's such a dark view, and I don't think there's any backing for it, to be honest. I mean, you could always find a reason to be miserable and to suffer, right? You could always find something wrong in your life, but you could also find something right.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, and it would take just as much effort to find the right thing, and then you would actually be rewarding yourself by doing that. I mean, like, no one. You don't want to die in stagnation. Like you don't want to. It's a lot scarier to think about being on this earth if you don't have a meaning or you don't find a meaning before you leave it. So you might as well put in the effort to do something that will make you feel like you've added to something that's greater than yourself.
and there's always to go with your curtain analogy, you can pull back the curtain, but there's going to be another
Hmm.
curtain behind it.
Yeah, yeah,
Always. There's always going to be another curtain. You're never going to, even with scientific discovery, right? As soon as we discover something new, we just find out, oh, dark matter exists. And we have no idea how to possibly comprehend that. Or, we discover neuroscience, but it has nothing to do with consciousness and it has no explanation for it, right? So we pull back these curtains and we can continue to do so, and we will continue to do so, assuming the civilization stabilizes and maintains itself. But we're never gonna reach utopia to the point where there's nothing else left to discover. I mean, if you just think about the origin of the universe, how are we ever going to find that out? How are we ever going to, and I guess you could say the Big Bang. That's not what I mean. Like, could you ever find out the why of the universe through empirical measures? Could you ever find out about multiple universes? I mean, maybe, but still, if there are infinite universes, which some people suspect and theorize, then infinity is infinity. You don't conquer infinity, right? That just doesn't happen. Life and this world and this space that we're in is infinite, and studies are infinite, and the things you can learn are infinite. They're limitless. So it's too complicated to put some sort of negative spin on it and just say it's this. Life's just a
yeah,
coincidence, right?
yeah.
And look, if you want to believe that, you can. But to quote Dr. Peterson, because I haven't done it yet this podcast, I
There's got to be one.
as he says, I act as if God exists, and we can subsidize God for whatever you want, right? And the reason he says that is because he's observed that his life is better when he has a belief that his life matters. If you don't believe your life matters, your life's not going to be good. Because nothing you do in your head will register as being beneficial to you. Everything will just be the next step until I die. And it's of no consequence. And achievements mean nothing. Social interactions mean nothing. Maybe pleasure means something, but that's it.
It's a good point. And I think the more that people go down the path of science, well, people forget that science arose in a non-secular world, even, and that there are certain fundamentals that I think humans need to be productive, to feel fulfilled in life. And if you just disband those entirely, then maybe that's something that evolution will take care of, or maybe it's something that it has taken care of through generations, is dealing with the innate need for humans to have abstraction and metaphor and you know, storytelling, or that sort of thing. And if you're just a pure scientist, then you're deprived of all the other important things.
Yeah, I don't even believe a pure scientist exists. When people say
Right.
when people say that they think life is a coincidence or that they don't believe in anything, it's not that they're lying, right? But the way they behave, it points to the contrary every time, right? When somebody that like is a, and look, if you're atheist, fine. I've talked about it on this podcast before. I used to be an atheist, but if you went up to an atheist and said, "I'm going to kill your mother," right? The atheist would say, or or somebody that says life is meaningless, right? We'll even go further because I won't, because there's atheists who are humanists who believe who have sets of beliefs. But let's just say somebody who says they really have no beliefs, right? You say, "I'm going to kill your mother," they're going to say, "Please don't," right? They're going to try to stop you,
Yes.
unless they're a psychopath, right? And even if they're a psychopath, they have other interests. So human nature is contrary to empirical science, right? It doesn't fit in that box, and people ascribe themselves religion or belief, even if they think they don't, right? Everybody is religious. They ascribe it to something, and a lot of people ascribe it to science. A lot of people use science as their religion, and you can't question the scientific dogma. It's like, you sound like a priest from the 15th century, right?
Yep.
And they would be using the same arguments. This is proven. This is unquestionable. Don't question this, right? And not all priests in the 15th century were like that. Not all scientists were like that. But that is certainly the image we have in the modern world about religious people, about them saying you can't question, you can't do this. When in reality, I hear a lot of that from the scientific community, that this is something that cannot be. This is the faith, so to speak, or you can see it with like the modern woke movement, or you can see it with. You could see it with politics, right? People who are just like, I'm. Give an example, like I'm a Republican and that's who I am, and like all my beliefs revolve around that, or I'm a Democrat and that's who I am, and I really don't think that it's healthy to ascribe that religious figure that we all have to something as temperate and limited as a ideology. I think it needs something more profound, something that really has metaphorical truth. I don't think there's much metaphorical truth in liberalism or conservatism, like as much like there. It's maybe some of it hints at those original beliefs, but the issues on the front line have nothing to do with that. You need something that's, in my opinion, deeper down, deeper rooted, and it doesn't need to be a mainstream religion, but I do think it does. You do need to have something that backs up the way that you behave and the way that you interact, even if it's something like music, like that's something a lot more profound than like Marxism or something like fascism. Like if those are your religions or your ideologies and that's what you're prescribing all that energy to, it's going to go down a bad road.
Yeah, I mean, it's the question of like, how does this happen if there's so much spectacle or so much marvel about life itself, then how do we find ourselves fighting individuals who want to deconstruct a lot of that even today? Yeah, and I think science isn't complicit to that problem, but it certainly has emerged as a religious, or it has religious tendencies that I guess don't hold water compared to actual practices of faith. And I think that science in the way it's kind of weaponized in the modern context has some consequences as well, because suddenly it matters whether or not a politician, quote unquote, cares about the science or follows the science.
And the
I think
science doesn't even know what the
that's a slippery
science
slope.
is. Like the science,
Yeah, because
they prove themselves wrong every other day. There's not like they come out, they say the CDC says, and we don't have to get political, but the CDC didn't say till July that masks would be beneficial. And then you have other people saying that they would be, and then they flip and they flop and they go every direction. And that's just the history of science. Like it's always been like that, right? So you say trust the science, like it's you, not you, but people say trust the science. Why aren't you trusting the scientists? It's like the scientists don't even trust the science. They don't even know what the science is, right? They're trying, but they're going to prove themselves wrong in 5 months. That doesn't mean you shouldn't listen to the science. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't study the science. But it does mean you need to take that with a grain of salt, that this is not some perfect system. In fact, if anything, science is proven to be just as infallible as every other part of the human race, right? Or just as fallible, yeah. So did I say infallible? I don't know. But it is. Okay, it is just as fallible as every other part of the human race. And if we just take a look and just look at the history of scientific achievements, it's a history of us proving ourselves wrong, and then proving what we proved wrong, and then proving that wrong. And look, I know the sun is out there, and I know we're revolving around the sun. Like, I'm very confident in that because we've had years and years of studies and years of empirical evidence and people actually flying to space and seeing it. So I'm pretty confident in that answer, and I'm pretty confident that the world isn't flat, right? But when we talk about these new scientific achievements, it's like, well, hold on, something could come out in a year that would totally shake our whole understanding of what a virus even is, or how these things interact. Or, tomorrow everybody could say, don't wear a mask, it makes it worse. And I'm not advocating to wear a mask or not wear a mask, by the way. I wear a mask. But, again, I don't really want to get political. Although I'm not shy of doing that on this platform. But I feel like that would taint, I think that would taint this otherwise amazing conversation.
purely unbiased, a scholarly, intellectual pursuit.
Yeah,
but yeah, that's it. Non-confrontational, totally passive. Just a nice summary. But yeah, I mean, that's a thing. I think it was 2015. Some psychologists did this huge, basically, replication review where they took like the 150 most prominent psychological experiments that have been done since the beginning of the 20th century. And they wanted to directly replicate them to see if the results held. And like over half of them didn't. So things that have been in our textbooks, these seminal works of psychology that we base our study on, of our, the behavioral mental processes, they don't hold water. But we found that one really interesting, cool, significant effect back in 1934. So, of course, it's awesome. But then no one thought, well, maybe there were other confounds or maybe there were other situations in which this effect would not hold. And it took until 2015 for this massive, review paper to come out to say that, well, kind of half of everything that you've been taught as significant to the study of psychology isn't, or maybe it's not as strong of a finding as it was first reported or put into the pedagogy of psychology as, which is scary because, like you said, I mean, science, that's like you say that scientists prove themselves wrong thousands of times, and like in a way that's the goal because you constantly want to be rejecting or as my advisor in undergrad puts it, knowledge is the reduction of uncertainty. it's science shouldn't be giving answers. It should be removing possibilities, if that makes sense. And I think that science, in the way that it's even reported in mainstream media, is reported as this, judge that just gives answers. When in reality, all it's doing is saying, well, this thing, and this thing don't really contribute to that phenomenon. But it gets flipped around and says, oh, well, this thing directly causes this thing. And that's where we have a problem, because science can't be absolute in that way. At least I don't think so.
Well, and then now the hard sciences, like math, will come out and say, well, this is why psychology is bullshit.
Well, of course. I mean,
of course.
That's basically it.
I mean, and I think exactly, and that doesn't mean psychology is useless to study, right? If 20% of what it is has been right, then I think it's useful, right? Even if 80% of it is something that will be proven wrong, it's still a step. Because, it's like Edison inventing the light bulb. When he invented it, he said, I didn't find 10,000 ways. I didn't fail 10,000 times. I found 10,000 ways not to make a light bulb, and only one way to, right? So it is kind of like that. And, history is interesting as well. It's definitely not a science. It has archaeology, which you could say is more scientific. But, historically, we're looking at primary sources, and nothing about it is purely empirical, right? But we know these things happened, and the story they tell is extremely impactful, and that's vitally important. We gotta get you and my brother on a podcast sometime. You guys both going for your PhDs.
Yeah, that would be awesome. I'm sure he has a bit more knowledge than me, since he's a few years older. But
he just got his master's.
Talk with him.
He's doing Jungian psychology, as you know, and I can't get a conversation with that guy without him mentioning genetics. I need somebody in there to moderate.
I mean, I could. I think I find. I mean, some psychologists that I've taken classes with, they're in the ecological side of psychology, and that's to say that your environment dictates your behavior, or rather, you have this kind of reciprocal relationship with your environment, that you do something and then the context kind of justifies your behavior. I think that kind of goes against some purely like nativist, like your genes are this way, therefore you behave this way. So I could give my 2 cents about that sometime soon.
Well, he's not strictly like that. He's got a pretty balanced approach. What he would say is that for a long time people haven't considered the genetic side enough, and so he kind of tries to overcompensate in some ways, while still he believes environment plays a factor, of course. It's just funny. Anyway, man, this has been awesome.
This has been great.
Definitely, I definitely was not qualified to be asking you those.
Yes, you were. Yeah. No, I appreciate it, because I mean, like another personal critique I have of science is like, oftentimes people just talk to other scientists about this stuff, and if you can't, give succinct answers about the things that you do, then you're kind of like failing, because you have to be able to communicate these ideas. So, like, and in the other way, you almost ask better questions because you see it differently, or the information that I tell you like caused you to ask a question that actually might be more nuanced than some technical jargon that I might be confronted with at a conference or something. So definitely appreciate it. Don't think that you're not qualified.
It's just imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
The beginning,
True that.
the beginning when you were going on about the visual audio connection, I was like, this is really deep. Like I'm in over my head on some of this, but
Yeah,
I'll give I'll give it my best shot.
yeah, I mean that's kind of a fault maybe on mine, is that I should be able to say it in a way that even I like the phrase is used is like, well, can you explain your research to your aunt or like to your grandma, like someone who theoretically doesn't have that expertise, and if you can, then you're doing all right. So
I think you did.
The
I think you did an excellent job, Tony.
awesome. Yeah.
Any if a dullard like me could understand 5% of it, I think that you're doing quite good work.
Perfect. Yeah.
Well, anyway, thanks for coming on. I hope you guys enjoyed, and we'll be back soon for another episode. Please like and subscribe and share if you enjoyed this content. Tony, once again, thanks for coming on, man. I hope to have you on again soon.
I appreciate it. That'd be great.
All right, guys, we're going to head out.